Mr. Lee was a certified pilot, and a pretty adventurous one to boot. One day he thought, well, we're in New Zealand, there's farms everywhere, and I'm a pilot. So I should start a business to spray fertilizers on farms, but from planes. And Mr. Lee set up a company named Lee's Air Farming Limited to do exactly that. He was, effectively, the sole shareholder of the company, and he was also its sole director and chief pilot. Keep the chief pilot title in mind for a bit, because we'll be talking about that a lot in today's video. Now, back to the story. Unfortunately, on a particularly adventurous day at work, Mr. Lee was killed in a plane crash. Leaving the gory details aside, his wife, Mrs. Lee, then tried to claim workers' compensation for her husband's death. Let's pause here. Mrs. Lee was trying to get workers' compensation. That meant that Mr. Lee, the pilot, had to be a worker. But workers are hired by bosses. We all know that. Put in legal terms, employees are hired by employers. So, was Mr. Lee a worker or a boss? It certainly looked like he was a boss. He had set up the company himself and was basically its sole shareholder and sole director. But remember, he was also the chief pilot. That sounds like a position you'd apply for if you were looking for a job. And that's exactly what it was. With all this in mind, you might say that Mr. Lee had just hired himself as the chief pilot. But quite clearly, you cannot hire yourself. Because think about it, you cannot possibly be a worker if you are also the boss. Workers only exist once they are hired by their bosses. So there must be two parties to this relationship. And that's exactly what the New Zealand Court of Appeal found, and they threw out Mrs. Lee's claim. But the case went on appeal again, this time to the UK Privy Council. There, it was found that Mr. Lee was a worker, and it followed that Mrs. Lee was entitled to workers' compensation. Okay, so that just happened. How did the Privy Council reach its conclusion? Now, if you watched the last video on the Salomon & Salomon case, you might remember that the company has a separate legal personality from its shareholders. And this principle applies even if the company is a one-man company. Lee's Air Farming Limited was clearly a one-man company, so according to the principle from Salomon & Salomon, its separate legal personality should be upheld, save for exceptional circumstances. Okay, that's a little complicated, but please follow me just for a little bit more. Remember that earlier on we played with the thought of Mr. Lee hiring himself. Now, with the principle of separate legal personality in mind, we might now consider that it wasn't Mr. Lee who had hired himself, but it was Lee's Air Farming Limited, the company that hired Mr. Lee. Put simply, Mr. Lee was a worker, and his company was his boss. But there's one last piece of the puzzle that we haven't quite figured out. What created the worker-boss relationship between Mr. Lee and his company? The answer to that question lies in an important document that controls all the relationships involving the company, the Articles of Association. Let's play with some legal terminology. If you've ever had a job, you might remember signing an employment contract when you took the job up. Your boss handed over the document to you, and once you signed it, you and your boss were obliged to follow whatever the contract told you both to do. What am I getting at here? Well, the employment contract you just signed is a contract like any other. Contracts are simply agreements between two or more people, and there's nothing that stops the company from being one of those parties. Now, in the Lee and Lee's Air Farming case, the Articles of Association of Lee's Air Farming Limited contained some words which stated that Mr. Lee would be the chief pilot. And what are the Articles of Association? At the very foundational level, they are contracts. It was that, the articles of the company, which created the employment relationship between Mr. Lee and Lee's Air Farming Limited. So, in today's video, we covered quite a lot of things. We told the story of Mr. Lee and his company and how the principle of separate legal personality, as well as language in the company's articles of association, created their employment relationship. As with the video on the Salomon and Salomon case, I'd just like to note that the principle of separate legal personality is not absolute, and exceptional circumstances may call for the so-called piercing of the corporate veil. But these are rather exceptional, and we will not talk about them in this video. With all that said though, thank you so much to all of you for watching this video, and I really hope it was useful for your understanding. Now at this point, I'd also like to give a massive thanks to Xiao Tong for the wonderful caricatures used in this video. You can check her stuff out with the link in the description. Please take care of yourselves, and much cheers to you all.